The main man is in the room, so we can start. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts. Welcome to the MFA in Design Criticism. My name's Alice Twemlow. Great to see you. Thank you very much. Some of you, actually for the second time this week, we've had a bit of a busy week. Earlier on Tuesday we had Robert Krulwich from Radiolab talking about his extremely interesting career. He's a very funny guy. If you're not familiar with it, the MFA in Design Criticism, or DCRIT as it's also known, is a 2-year MFA program devoted to criticism, writing, thinking, research, curation, and all other media forms around the topics of design, architecture, and infrastructure. So there's a website with lots more details, which I would recommend you to take a look at. And I would also mention that we have a 2-week intensive, as we call it, devoted to design, writing and research, and this will be the 3rd year we've been running this, and it's really great fun way to immerse yourself into some of the interests and approaches of this program. We do a lot of site visits, we do a lot of one-on-one tutorials, a lot of writing workshops. This is a sort of sample of one of the weeks. We really sort of pack it full. We have people like Rob Walker come to work with students on developing stories, really compelling narratives about objects. We work on developing profiles about design studios, starting with reporting techniques and the art of the interview, building up to looking at the profile as an art form with Jennifer Cabot. And we do things like visiting the ICP archive to work with Ouija photographs and do research on them and then tell almost like fictional narratives about them. It's a lot of fun. So I urge you to take a look if that's the kind of thing you're interested in. There's a postcard somewhere around for you to look at. And one more housekeeping announcement, which is our upcoming conference. This is the conference where graduates of the program will be telling us about all their fantastic research they've been doing for the last year. This year they've titled the conference Lingua Franca, and we've got a really good lineup of speakers actually. It'll be moderated by Justin McGuirk, a British architecture critic, and we'll also feature museum curator from Hong Kong, Eric Chen, as well as Peter Lunenfeld from LA and Sylvia Lavin, another architecture critic. So a really nice lineup, plus the amazing students themselves. You'll be receiving much more details on that in the lead up. All right. So to the lecture series. The spring lecture series, most of them actually are organized by the students themselves, and I put the students on the spot to introduce and Q&A the speakers, and Justin did a great job of that on Tuesday with Robert. Well done. But tonight they can all relax because I want the privilege of talking to Rick. So there's more to come, as you can see. If you've missed any, I would urge you to check out our website where we have a link to all of our videos of past lectures on Vimeo. And you may spot on the upper left-hand corner tonight's speaker. Rick Poynor has visited the DCRIT program annually, pretty much since we started the program back in 2008. He's conducted workshops with the students and delivered lectures to all of us. He's spoken about writing columns, curating an exhibition on surrealism and graphic design, writing with images, that was last year's, and manifestos. And it's possible that some of you have attended all of them. We're really lucky, I think, to have Rick as a kind of orbiting conscience, both for the program and the community it serves a hub for, you guys. Like our own private transatlantic visiting physician, he arrives once a year with a doctor's bag full of bitter pills that not many in design criticism, let alone the larger design media, are qualified to prescribe. And we sorely need them. He's been working with the students today, actually, leading a critical takedown workshop, attempting to resuscitate the lost art of adversarial combative critical writing in the inhospitable intellectual climate which we find ourselves in, of pluralism, ironic distance, and an accepting promotional culture. So it's tough. It's a tough atmosphere in which to grow that kind of writing. So I listened in to a part of the workshop this morning as Rick told the students how critics need to navigate a path between the simplistic binary of the likety-likes on the one hand and the haters on the other. So he described this kind of rich sort of middle ground, a fertile territory for critics, which he refers to as in the phrase complicated grey world, which I really like. And I would reiterate this urging for us all to continue our explorations there. And should we need a guide to follow in Rick's footsteps? So I know you're all very familiar with Rick's work. I'll cruise through his extremely long bio fairly fast. But, you know, for those of you new to Rick, he's a British writer, critic, lecturer, curator, specialised in the broad spectrum of visual culture. He is a visiting professor in design criticism and research methods at the Royal College of Art in London. He writes a column for Print magazine and a blog for Design Observer about visual culture titled Adventures in the Image World. We know him best probably as the founding editor of I magazine in London, which he edited from 1990 to 1997, and he continues to write the critique column for I. He's written many books, among them a brilliant one on Jan van Toorn from 2008, and several collections of essays, including one you see up here, Bay the Giant, and Designing Pornotopia. He contributes many essays and chapters to books, one of which he will be discussing tonight. And his most recent exhibition, Uncanny, Surrealism and Graphic Design, was one he discussed with us a couple of years ago, was the first international and historical survey of this subject. It was on show in Brno in the Czech Republic and also in Rotterdam in 2011. So tonight, Rick brings a kind of melding of his interests between visual culture and literature to the classroom. And so, well, let's just get him up here and get started. Please welcome Rick Poynor. Would you like your first slide? Or would you
Why not?
Thank you. There you go. Enjoy.
Great. Thanks. How's that? Can you hear me okay? Or do I need to get closer to this thing? How's that? Is that better? I think it was just a bit low. Right, I have to make one more adjustment. No, I don't. You've done it for me. Thank you very much. Anyway, good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be here again. It's going to sound like I'm really being creepy-crawly in response to what the very kind things that Alice just said. But this really is one of the places I really like coming and talking. This room, I've got quite fond of this room over the, there's a kind of hot pressure cooker feel in here after a while, which is a lot of fun. And it's, and I have to say, I think I've been shown astonishing indulgence, and maybe with this talk on Dom Sylvester Houédard, who I'll explain in a second, of course, maybe I push it too far. I hope not. I hope not. I hope this amuses at least some of you. First, does anyone know the book? Yeah, 2 or 3 hands, but I mean, of course, if you all knew the book, there'd be no point in my coming. So that's that came out at the end of 2012. I do have an essay in there, so this is a mini plug, but really it's a plug for the book itself and the publisher, Occasional Papers in London, small independent publisher, does art books, few design books, interested in the crossovers between the two, as indeed am I. And this book is very representative, actually, of their extraordinarily generous, wide-ranging interests. So if you're into small-scale indie publishing, I think you should know about Occasional Papers, and I'm sure the material is available over here in the right sort of bookshops, certainly available online, so do watch out for it. So, like I say, I wrote an essay at their request, at the editor's request, for this book, and it was one of those little dream commissions that you're kind of surprised happened, because I'd had a little obsession with this guy, Dom Sylvester Houédard, for a considerable while. And I'd even planned to write about him. I'd done quite a bit of research way back now in 2007, and what I had in mind was maybe a 8,000-word paper, which would probably go in an academic journal because who else was going to take it, about this guy. And I got so far with it, I went to his archive, which is in Manchester, England, looked at his 2,000 books, some about the history of religion, some about design, art, visual culture, as we call it now, and I kind of took fright. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute as I stumble to explain what it is that's so significant about this guy. But suffice it to say that the problem lies actually in the religious dimension of the work. And to truly penetrate this work, to truly understand it, we probably need to have some kind of understanding of that. And because I'm not really a religious person, and I certainly can't claim to span both Catholicism on the one hand and Buddhism on the other, I really don't feel qualified to explain that dimension of the work. The point, though, I think, and my justification, slender as it might be for being here, is that there's several sides to this guy. Maybe to fully understand him, to sort of triangulate him, you have to approach him from several different directions. So I'll approach from my particular direction, which may be similar to a number of you in the audience, in that I'm approaching it because I'm interested in type, in letter forms, in the history of typewriter art, and so on. It's a start, as it were. So there he is, born in 1924, died quite a long time ago now. I guess I heard about him shortly after he died. So I have known about him for about 20 years, and this is a sort of slow-growing, slow-burning interest in him. As you can see, it's probably obvious from the word Dom, he was a monk, a Dominican order. He lived in a place called Prinish Abbey in Gloucestershire in England, oldie worldy, historical. It does have a product. It produces incense, so a small commercial product, nicely packaged. But obviously, the people who live there, the monks, are devoted to a higher religious calling, a way of life. On the whole, it's quite a withdrawn existence. You live in your monastery or your abbey, as here. You don't go out into the world very much. A lot of your time goes on your devotions, your religious observances, and so on. And that's as it should be. You have been ordained, and that is your role. That is why you're there. And this is the really remarkable thing about Dom Sylvester Houédard, that somehow this man, who was primarily a monk, pursued this other life outside the monastery as part of the English art scene and art culture of the day. I mean, it's how he ever got away with it is a bit of a mystery. Clearly, he was considerably indulged by his abbots at the monastery, or the abbey rather, at various stages. So, just a bit of biographical background, not very much. There just isn't time for a lot of detail. His full name was Pierre Thomas Paul Joseph Houédard. He was sometimes known, as you'll see on the slides, just as DSH for short, sometimes as the Dom, sometimes as Pierre. You'll see his name, Sylvester, as I would say it, but apparently he said it's Sylvester. Sylvester is the approved way of saying it, sometimes spelt with an I, sometimes with a Y. So, his very name seems to waver. He was born on the island of Guernsey. He lost both his parents while he was still a teenager, and he went to live with an aunt. In 1940, of course, Second World War, he was evacuated to the UK. That's where he lived thereafter. In 1942, so during the war, he went up to Oxford to study modern history, but as with a lot of people in the war, that's interrupted. He went into army intelligence in 1944, did that till 1947, and then returned to Oxford to complete his studies. While he was in intelligence, he did a bit of travelling. I mean, I think this is important. He went to India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and he clearly during those years began to be exposed to these other religious ideas. And this is someone whose view of religion, is really very, very broad indeed. Though he was a Catholic, he's much wider in his sympathies, and he was always something of a bridge builder, particular particularly with Buddhism. So in 49 he joined the abbey here. Prinish is how you say it. It says Prinknash, but it's Prinish apparently, or Prinich even. Then in 59 he was finally ordained a priest. During that time, 51 to 54, he studied in Rome, and his concerns were philosophical. He was interested in the idea of liberty in Jean-Paul Sartre's writing. So, the philosophical interests were there from the start. As it now turns out, the artistic interests were there too. And I don't know how you say the name. Is it Aesopus? How do they say that? American Aesopus. If you look at the latest issue of Aesopus magazine, which is divided up into different sections, I think it's on the theme of archives, they've shown examples of his early drawings. They're almost caricature or cartoon-like, which are in the Sackner archive in Miami, the most incredible private archive of concrete poetry and visual poetry, of which this is part. And in fact, they probably are the major holders of Houédard's work. Cannily, the Sackners collected this stuff years ago, so they've got hundreds and hundreds of pieces. Alas, their website is an antique from the 90s, difficult to use. Alas, the images are shown in some cases, but extremely small in a way that seemed like a good idea then, but isn't very helpful now. But still you can see some of the work online, and I hope one day the Sackners, although it's a massive task, will do more to just make this material available, because they're sitting on an extraordinary archive of work. And I might say a bit more about the archival problems in a minute. So I think that gives you a kind of biographical introduction to the man. That's interesting. That was quite slow. Oh well, okay. We'll see how we go. So here I said about this sort of two, probably more than two aspects, but the two aspects that you really need to bear in mind. On the one hand, there he is, up a ladder in the library, in the abbey, studying books. He really was a scholar, although everything can always be qualified. I've spoken to people, who really know this life, and they say, well, strictly speaking, he was more of a gadfly, and yes, his knowledge was extraordinarily broad and deep, but he wasn't a scholar in the pure sense. But I think for our purposes, this is a very bookish, literary, historically minded, scholarly man. And in fact, a man of the more I look into him, the more I think a man of truly extraordinary intellect. And there again lies the problem in fully getting to grips with this guy, that we need to kind of rise up to his elevated level to do that. I want to give you a couple of readings. So one reading goes with Houédard, the religious man. This is from towards the end of his life, a sermon. I think more of this material is going to emerge over time, his religious writings. But anyway, this gives you a flavour of the way he thought and of the way he wrote. There is only one mysterium, that is God himself, who doesn't have being but is being, who doesn't have life but is life, and is the life he lives but never grows, never changes, who is truth and knows the truth he is, and is his own knowledge of himself. He alone can say, I am, and he reveals himself as the one who alone is I am. Our name for him is therefore Yahweh, or He is. But though we know that God is, the meaning of the word is we do not know. Not one of us can say, I am, since all we are who live and grow and are conscious can say is, I become, I change, I grow. So clearly there's a lot more where that came from. Now I want to move back in time to something he wrote in the early 60s, extraordinary essay called Beat and Afterbeat. And the beat there is beatnik, the beats. I mean, this is a monk sitting in his cell in an abbey in the 1950s who acquires an extraordinary knowledge of beat literature. The Ginsbergs, the Kerouacs, the Corsos, and all the rest of them. He knows this stuff inside out, and here he is writing in a journal called the Aylesford Review, which is edited by another monk, so that there were other kind of literary eccentrics in the world of the monasteries, and this essay is a kind of introduction to some of the issues that interested Houédard about beat writing. The subtitle is so beat and after beat, a parallel condition of poetry and theology ? So this goes to the heart really of what this work I'm going to show you is about. That he's finding parallels between here what poets do, contemporary poets do, and the religious explorations, the spiritual explorations that he's concerned with. The two are as one for him. But what I wanted to read was this introductory sentence or two, just to give the extraordinary flavour of the way he wrote. I mean, it really is in a kind of beat prose, a sort of bebop, riffing, jazz prose or something. So it just starts in a rush. So what's happening? 1963, time's running short, and poetry, the mad, sad joy of the shadow church, wefting nylon tantras into man and world and Yahweh, patching up the zimzum with a certified two-way stretch of now and bursting through our mental claptraps, gift wraps, and stale thought-think outlines with delirious mantic words, has come a bit unstuck. You might well wonder, what was the guy on? I mean, please, think the man, this is the man up the ladder, writing like he is some kind of beatnik groover. Absolutely extraordinary. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I had a third quotation just while we're sort of giving the dimension of the man, because, he was a spiritual man. This is one of his abbots talking about him. Later on, he knew him from the late 70s to the late 80s. He says of his colleague, quote, "In his own way, he lived his life very faithfully, but he wasn't a typical monk." You're not kidding. Most monks are not so wrapped up in intellectual work as he was, for one thing. And for another, even as a human being, he was rather eccentric. He was a lovable person, and he was dedicated to the community, even if he felt we didn't always appreciate what he was doing. So, you get this sort of, that's gently put, but one senses at times that, this must have been an extraordinary figure to have in your midst. Over on the other side of the image, we see him out and about in the Signals Gallery. So this is the other side of his life. He manages to get out, down to London. He dons the beret, the cape, I'm told leather trousers on occasion, and hangs out with the artists. So, a show opening there. And, as is going to become apparent, this is a guy who had a vast network of colleagues and correspondents. There is an address book, and it has 3,000 names in, and he really was ultra prolific. He was constantly writing to people, and I'll show you examples of those letters, which are extraordinary in themselves, in a moment. I mentioned there's religious writings. This is, it's already 2,000 now, but these are his commentaries on the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. Some of you might be familiar with the name. It's pretty extraordinary stuff. I mean, I'm told there's more coming from this publisher, Bashara Publications. But that too has been sort of hidden and not particularly well known since his death in '92. This is my starting point, so I can bring it back down to around to design now. Back in the 1990s, I decided to do some academic study of my own at the Royal College of Art. I just wanted to do an MPhil. That's the sort of size of project I had in mind, and I decided to study a magazine called Typographica. Some of you may know it, published from 49 through to 67, an important magazine in the history of European post-war design and typography, though it was broader actually and had art subjects and very interesting mixture of new work and rediscoveries of some of the early heroic period of modernism. So I started to look at this thing, obviously before I began the study, and I guess that was where I first really took notice of Dom Sylvester. This extraordinary article published in '63 called, as you can see, Concrete Poetry and Ian Hamilton Finlay. Now, some of you may know that Ian Hamilton Finlay was a Scottish concrete poet, so of the same era, an important figure. the article attempts to do two things. It's an introduction to concrete poetry, then it moves on to talk about Finlay. And Finlay is the kind of least interesting part of it. What is extraordinary is the early, longer section about concrete poetry. It's always said that this is, well, it's certainly the first attempt to explain and introduce concrete poetry in Britain. Sometimes it's said to be the first one in America as well. I just don't believe that. But there were people emerging around that time. Concrete poetry had kind of got underway in the mid-50s. Places as far apart as Brazil and Switzerland. There was a lot of activity then, manifesto writing and so on. It arrived later in Britain. I guess Houédard discovers it on the back of his interest in the beats and in visual poetry as a historical phenomenon. We're not going to go into that now, but the roots of all this can be traced back a very long way. And so he writes this article, and it's who reads this magazine? Well, I suppose it's the emerging generation of professional designers. 63, it's all pretty new, in London at that point. It's printers; they would be reading a publication like this as well. And apparently, it's monks too, because goodness knows how. But he's reached the point where he's a contributor. He's been following it. He likes it. He's in touch with the editor, Herbert Spencer, and so on. And that's also my introduction, because when I went through Spencer's archive, I found a file of letters from Houédard and some typestracts, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is just one spread from the article. It actually shows a poem by Finlay there as well. I don't think there's any way around this. Some of this is a bit fiddly and complicated, so I'm just going to give a few quotes from the article itself to highlight some key points, as it were. Firstly, Houédard points out that there's been this change in speaking and writing, and he's obviously been looking at advertisements, and he mentions pictographs as well, slogans. He's interested in this kind of compression which is happening in typographic culture, that designers, and he realizes it's designers who are manipulating this typographic material, are saying more with less. He compares this there with concrete poetry, and he says that the poem is kinetic. It forces the reader to, as he puts it, cross the border and enter it. In other words, you've got to make work to get into it. And again, he compares the syntax of this new concrete poetry to headlines, title pages, telegrams, pidgin English, posters, and so on. And he says that this new concrete poetry fractures linguistics, and that the poet and reader meet in maximum communication with minimum words. So that's what he's saying in 1963 in this article. This is another key point, and it's actually a quote from an earlier manifesto about concrete poetry. He says that concrete poetry begins by being aware of space as its structural agent. This is a really interesting point, and it's kind of relevant to some of what you'll see in a minute when I show his work, that you've got the space of the page. Well, where does the material, the typographic material, the concrete poem, fall on the page? He's saying that its position in space, the spaces within it, separating the groups of characters, are all part of the matter of the poem. It's not like a traditional poem where you read the type on the page and, all right, there may be a bit of setting out, indented lines and so on, and that does have consequences for the reading and therefore the meaning of the poem. But the concrete poem goes much further than that. Then in this lower quotation, he says an interesting thing. He says that, he makes a big claim, in fact, the battle of typographer and poet, representing form on the one hand, content on the other, is over. And he argues in 1963 that poet and typographer, representing again soul and I, are coming together in the same person. Again, that's an extraordinary radical notion that we could question whether it's been fulfilled even now. One more brief set of quotes from this article. And it really, you can read this in Looking Closer 3. It's actually easily accessible. It's probably here in the library. That was at my instigation when we put that book together, the historical writings on graphic design. I persuaded my fellow editors it should be in there. I think they were probably flummoxed, baffled by the thing, and just waved it through. But it was I regarded that as a small triumph, because we began to reintroduce Houédard to contemporary graphic culture at that point. Anyway, another key statement about concrete poems, if you want to understand what they are. He says, concrete poems just are. So just are, in the sense that they are material existences. They are just there. They don't need to have linguistic content at all. I mean, there are concrete poems, so-called, made up of images of eyes with no words. They don't have to be linguistic. Again, it's just the assertion of this material on the page and the invitation to you, the reader, as he says, to cross the border and enter into it, to try and extract some meaning, some significance from it. But clearly you cannot analyze and break down the poem in the way that we were all taught to break down a classic piece of English poetry in school, for instance. High school, that is. So they just are. They're objects like toys and tools, he says, jewel-like concrete things in themselves. Again, expressing their materiality. Then, this is another important idea, and one that I fear that I just will not explore in the depth that is really needed. He says one of the characteristics, too, an important characteristic of concrete poetry, is that it is eyeless or egoless, that it is self-effacing. It's not, interesting word he uses here, mimetic of the poet. It doesn't, represent some inner life of the poet in the way that we are, again, taught the poem does. He says concrete poetry is not subjective, at least in any kind of explicit sense. So again, he's stressing the kind of external materiality of the poem. And I said there was these were fertile conditions in which kind of overlaps, cross-fertilizations were occurring. So what you're looking at here is, again, it's sort of compressed. It's actually an example of New York work by Brownjohn, Chemaeff, and Geismar from the end of the 50s. This was published as a little booklet, well, by them initially here, and then again in Typographica magazine, so a little booklet on a thread in the publication. What you're looking at, though, is not one of the original pages. This is taken from a little book from the time that took all of these typographic games and brought them all together handily on a couple of sheets. So it's slightly false. In the original, you would have seen just the adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing one. That would have occupied a page, if you like. And so all of these are separate elements. But it gives you a sense of what watching words move is like. And Houédard, I know this because there is a letter in which he says it. He was wildly enthused about this. He thought this was fantastic stuff. He wrote to Herbert Spencer, the editor of Typographica, and he said, who was the genius who did this? He actually used the word genius. And these are typographic experiments exploring the possibility of embodying meaning within the orthography of the word itself, the revised spelling of the word itself. So they were produced, as it were, for a ultimately professional purpose. They are explorations. But to Houédard, these were concrete poems in their own right. He saw an absolute equivalence between what the concrete poets were doing and what these progressive, contemporary New York designers were doing. And so there's a lot of that kind of interchange at the time. This is Herbert Spencer, kind of spin-off exhibition from Typographica. It was called Typography in Britain Today. This image was also used on a cover of Typographica. It's done by Spencer himself. But if you look at the way that he's using this typographic material, he's treating it like a kind of concrete poem. He's not particularly concerned with linguistic meaning. He's playing with the letter forms. He's recombining them. He's crushing them together in new configurations. Just now I mentioned the correspondence that Houédard sent Spencer. These are two of the pieces I found in Spencer's files back there in the mid-90s it was. And these are the so-called typestracts. So that was the word that Houédard used for his visual or concrete poems. There's a lot of debate about whether these truly were concrete poems, but I'm not, I think it's hair-splitting, and I'm not going to get into that. The word typestract, though, is absolutely clear, isn't it? Type, we can see it's type, and stract from abstract. They are typewriter abstractions. Someone else came up with the word, another poet, Edwin Morgan, he described these things as typestracts, and it stuck. Houédard thought it was good and stuck with it. These, we can see these are just made from the letter M. They're obviously, as I keep saying, made in the typewriter. We've probably got his, the very model that he used, the Olivetti Lettera 22, a design classic, as many of you know, I'm sure. This is a small sheet, so it's smaller than A4, probably is A5. If any, I guess many of you will have had a go on typewriters. I know we don't use them now. Some people are kind of returned to them. This is why, in a way, I think all this is timely, that people are playing around with typewriters again, intrigued by them. I've got designer colleagues who actually insist on writing to me on their typewriters because they just love the look of the typewritten character. So that's what it is, a small sheet which can be turned easily. You release the carriage lock and you kind of turn the page round. So it's incredibly painstaking work to do one of these. I mean, just imagine what a fiddle it is to get this right. The other thing I will say at this point, and I'll probably repeat it as well, is you're looking at this huge on a screen like it was a poster or something. The original is really small. And when these are exhibited in, as they are in galleries at times, in frames, you've got to go in very, very close to look at one of these things properly, like you would if you had received it in an envelope and got it out and look. You'd have it in front of you. And when you do that, you become hyper-aware of the pressure of the blow on the key that produces the character, and the way, if you vary the pressure, you can vary the amount of ink on the page, the sense of density, the heaviness or lightness of the character. So that these things are actually very subtle as objects. I would go so far as to say they have a kind of beauty in them as a result. But it's it's an intimate, close-up beauty that requires you to get in very close. But they're delightful anyway. There's the typewriter, which you've already seen. And here's the correspondence I was talking about. It's like, the humble letter gets turned into a work of art, set out like it was a piece of poetry, always the use of red for contrast. These strange little things which are like typewriter doodles that just wander in from the edge. I mean, they almost look like little village settlements photographed from the air or something. Got a beautiful quality. Herbert Spencer, his wife Marianne there. There's an enormous sense of affection in producing something like that. It almost is a little act of love, isn't it? To get, you sit there, you spend ages on this. I mean, he was legendary for working through the night, tapping away at that cell of his, annoying the other monks trying to sleep. But there's an enormous amount of labour in creating just a simple communication, with everyday tidbits and bits of news in. I very much hope that one day some enterprising PhD student is going to. I would say a full catalogue raisonné is almost an impossibility, but someone needs to try and track down all this material. I was doing research, so I stumbled across a little treasure trove in someone's file. Given that there are 3,000 correspondence, and that they were globally dispersed, this work is all over the place. I bet people kept it. It'd be kind of crazy to deliberately throw it away. You could lose it over time. But I think these things will be treasured, and there are places we can start looking. But to actually produce a proper assessment of his work, we need to gather far more than we have at the moment. Anyway, typestracts, how they develop. So I guess around about 63, he's he's moving into this field. This is a fairly simple one. What's that? Italian walk through the woods. You can probably read the word tree there, and sure enough, a dot takes a kind of walk through this wooded element. Notice that it's signed. Almost all the work is very handily signed. No problems of dating here. DSH / and you can see the date. 30 June 63. Over and over again he signs them. I mean, and it is going to be an aid, because just imagine these things with no dates on. I mean, it would just be a kind of jumble. Some of the early pieces are structured, like this one. It's called Sonic Water. Only rarely am I going to venture any kind of attempt at explanation of these. I mean, and in a way, if I did try to explain them, I would be imposing my perception, my reading. That's not even in the spirit of the work. But anyway, it's Sonic Water, and it's presented in this very rigid geometrical fashion. But other early pieces are much freer, much more explosive. So here's one called Henri Chopin. The avant-gardists among you will know that Chopin was indeed himself, an avant-garde French poet, performance artist, one of these kind of protean art figures who that era, the 60s, just abounded with. Again, it seems almost like a gesture, a salutation, a gesture of friendship, a sort of overspill of positive emotion and good feeling. And it feels very loose and improvised, and there are different techniques going on. And in some ways, it's much messier than most of the work he's known for. Now here's another button press that didn't work. Here it comes. George. Who was George? I don't know who George was, but George's name is all over this one. It's all George. And he seems kind of keen on George, I would say. That's a fairly enthusiastic celebration of Georgeness going on there. But sort of beautiful. And again, I was talking about the density, the layers you can build up. You can really get a hint of it there. I think this one is one from the Sackner archive. This is one I scanned out of a book. So in a way, this is not the approved way of doing it, because I don't have a sense of how, because it was an old 60s illustration where routinely they would show the black graphic design or artwork on a page against the white space of the page. You don't know where the edge of the piece was. We actually need to get this piece, photograph it, and then we can see what it really was as a sheet. But again, it's in this more explosive, earlier style. Don't think this one's even titled. Has got the date, of course, showing us it's 1964. And what we've got there is, well, at first I thought it actually was about tomato. It seemed to be tomato. But certainly we've got the letter A and then M-O-T in French word, mo. And that's what it seems to be. A mo, endlessly permutated. And it's still obviously, there is some sort of linguistic content in these early pieces, whether it's George or whether it's a mo, a word. There's something we can kind of grab hold of. However, this is also early. He's moving towards complete abstraction there. So I think that is the at symbol that has a different meaning for us now. And dots and dashes and nothing else, and no linguistic content whatsoever. So that really is a typewriter abstract. There's nothing else there other than this rather interesting design with the large void in it. And it is why some people said, well, actually, these are little abstract paintings. This isn't poetry. This is kind of abstract art produced on the typewriter. So, we could argue about that. I don't want you to think he was the only person in the world doing this kind of thing, because he absolutely wasn't. Typewriter art, in parallel with concrete poetry, has a long history. And again, I know for a fact there's a book in the pipeline from a London publisher looking at the history of typewriter art. It was always going to come back eventually. In the immediate sort of post-digital period, all of this looked clunky, old-fashioned. This is exactly the kind of time-consuming, antiquated technology we have to chuck out as irrelevant to us. Now, of course, we see that it's immensely charming, it's extraordinarily expressive, that it's redolent of a whole period of cultural history, that it's kind of shot through with a deep sense of romance, and the machines themselves are just wonderful and fascinating. So for all these reasons, it's kind of come back again, and the time is right, I think, to be looking at this and talking about it. But look at the date there. This is Workman, the Dutch designer, artist, and printer, a kind of, this is the modernist era, and I guess this is modernist work, but there's something kind of quirky and eccentric about his way of doing it. But there he was in the 20s creating these things he called type prints, which look, to my eye, very much like an Houédard typestract. Exactly the same idea. Rather beautiful piece of work there. And in the 60s too, when Houédard was operating, we've got someone like Jiří Kolar in Czechoslovakia, again producing something that to all intents and purposes is a typestract. So other people were doing it too. He's not the only person doing typestracts, and he's certainly not the only person using the typewriter to create visual poetry. That's the whole point. It was a huge, well, let's not exaggerate, I mean, it wasn't a Schwarzenegger movie, but it was a big international phenomenon, widespread and sort of fascinating in terms of the independent, small-scale publishing going on now, whether it's books or magazines, because all of that was happening in the 60s, in a more kind of technologically primitive way, but they were producing little limited edition runs of publications, collecting concrete poems together, publishing artist statements, theoretical writings about concrete poetry, histories of visual poetry. You'd get on a mailing list and someone would send you, you'd subscribe a bit of money, someone would send you something in the post, or you'd exchange these communications, these documents with your friends. Again, when you dig into the archives, and I saw a lot of this stuff up in Manchester, there's a sort of wealth of now forgotten material that's kind of ripe for rediscovery, publishing in books. I think it will all come back again. So I guess I've lived quite a long time now. I think sometimes we flatter ourselves with this notion that we're doing things for the first time and it's all brand new and we're so much more sophisticated. We have amazing technological tools, but in terms of art thinking, the conceptual side of things, the networking, the way in which like-minded individuals found each other even without social media, just by means of the good old snail mail, as we call it now, and we're connected in international networks of, fellow travelers. Quite remarkable. So it's all there waiting to be rediscovered. In 1964, Houédard became a part of exactly what I'm talking about, a new little press called Openings Press. If you really know your post-war British typographic history, you'll recognise the name Edward Wright, who was also designer, artist, linguist, very interested in linguistics, and another one of these kind of multi-talented figures. Typeface designer as well, and he was rather roped in, I think, by Houédard and a guy called John Furnival to be their typographic consultant. So he did the design of this, the leaflet that announces their program. You can just about see some of what they're setting out to do there on the right side, where it says openings are constituted by poet/typographer/artist. So, this kind of bringing together of these different areas of the visual arts. Openings are active poetry. Openings make everybody make poetry. All these ideas we have now about democratization, involving the viewer in the art experience and making them a co-conspirator, a contributor. It's all kind of there implicit in that. So they were doing this kind of small-scale publishing. there are lots of names I could give here. I don't want to sort of bombard you with them. But this guy, John Furnivall, was another important figure from that era in Britain, not in a world sense. Based in the art schools, artist, discovers letter forms as a kind of medium you can use for making artworks. Wasn't initially very attracted to concrete poetry, but loved Houédar's work. Houédard kind of forced himself on Furnivall. They became, as I say, friends and collaborators. This was a little find I made last year. It was kind of thrilling. I was going through a drawer of posters at the Royal College of Art in London, looking at old film posters for an article I wanted to write, and there, interleaved, forgotten at the bottom of a plan chest, was this poster for a talk that Houédard gave at the college in 1964. So, this it always fascinates me. It's one of the pleasures of doing this kind of work. Any time you get to delve into the overlooked material, it's not even archived, it's just stored. It's stored and forgotten a lot of the times. These kind of amazing wonders emerge. So I'd never seen that anywhere else, and we put it in the book, of course. These guys, and Houédard in particular, were real ambassadors or advocates for the cause of concrete poetry and visual poetry. As I said, this is quite a movement, so there are a lot of people interested, excited, involved at the time. In 1965 there was quite an important, in British terms, show in London called Between Poetry and Painting. It almost needs no explanation. There it is, that this is an art form that somehow exists between these supposedly, if we're going to be traditionalists, separate areas. It finds a place in the middle. It's curated by a woman called Yasha Reichardt, who's still around, still living in London, did a lot of really important exhibitions for the Institute of Contemporary Arts at the time. So, this, for someone like me, this is essential source material. I just stumbled across this going for 10 quid, whatever that is, $13, $14 in a bookshop in Charing Cross Road in London. Probably harder to get now, but actually in the 90s, a lot of this stuff, because it hadn't been rediscovered, was just sitting around, available quite cheap if you could find it. I mean, here in New York, I'm going to show things in a minute that I dealer over on the west side I went to once, turned out to have a little treasure trove of really great Houédard material, going for relatively small sums, $40 or whatever a piece. But again, harder to find now. So we can't go into all this in great detail. Here's another example of one of these self-published pamphlets full of concrete poems from that era. 1966, there was a big gathering again in Gloucestershire, this event called Arlington Oon. Here we are, the concrete poets gathering together, doing a reading. I think they're probably doing Kurt Schwitter's sound poem. So that they showed the work, and it was a gathering of the clans, as it were. Houédard, pretty key to it. And I mean, come on, doesn't he look cool? The guy's a monster. Look at those shades. Look, his head to tone black. He's practically a designer in spirit. Later on, well, not so late actually, but this is 66, but through into the 70s, the typestracts become much cleaner in design, much more structured, much more pared down and minimal. And then you also get, which is immediately apparent here, the sense of the space of the page having three-dimensional depth. I mean, you can't fail to read this as some kind of vertical pole with these planes articulating out from it. It's you could try to just see it in terms of the flatness of the page, but it's hard. The eye immediately resolves that into something that has some sort of three-dimensional depth and a kind of architectural quality too. And you're going to see that a lot. Others, like this. Now, I'm showing this one partly because it has a terrific title, Splendid Weeping, that invites, all kinds of interpretations. But look, he's used the, to be technically accurate, the parenthesis symbol on the typewriter, and he's used it to construct these, they're almost like flickering flames. I mean, it's a very beautiful effect. I wish we knew more about the process of trial and error by which these things were made. And, were there false starts? Were there failures? Were some of these designs, if design's the right word, these constructions, were they sketched out? I mean, they're so controlled, some of them, it seems quite remarkable if he simply created it in front of himself on the typewriter. How could you ensure everything fell in the right position? And you're going to see a number of those where we have to ask, well, such as this one. Again, I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to what this is ultimately about. A lot of these things look almost like puzzles set in IQ tests that you could see had a very particular kind of intelligence. There's a quality of visual conundrum about a lot of these pieces. So again, this is meticulously constructed here. And if I wander over here, you can see how the sides are composed of letters, all of which make words. So just here we have the word grass. I barely read this stuff myself. But what I wanted to tell you, which we can ponder about a bit, is this one here. It says shags. Do I need to explain that? It's English slang, but I'd have thought not. Kind of interesting that a monk is joking around like that, isn't it? So there's a humanity, there's an earthiness. Maybe there's sexuality manifested in a way through some of this work too. Again, this kind of amazing kind of architectural constructions. It suggests a kind of zigzag screen in space, a particular way of looking indeed. Well, this is 1971, so he keeps going with this for quite a few years, but it does come to an end, sort of mid to late 80s. He stops doing it for various reasons. Actually, in part, maybe that's because this sort of visual poetry, concrete poetry, was running its course. There's 2 decades, from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, and I'm not talking about the entire world because different cultures were different, but certainly in Britain, there's a feeling that that's the span of it, and then after that, the diehards are still doing it, but interest has moved on. There's not the same sense of the culture, the publishing, the exhibitions flourishing in quite the same way. Here's another one with a bit of French in. But again, you see there's a lot of variety. Or this one. This one is fantastic. I mean, to me, this really does suggest some kind of religious architecture almost, or a site of ritual. Extraordinary looking thing. And this. I'm going to speed up a bit. So this is a series called For the Five Vowels. You're looking at I there. I'm just going to show 3 of them. These were exhibited not so long ago at the ICA in London. There was a show about word-based art from this period, and these were on the walls, and they're very, very beautiful they are too. And some are quite peculiar. I mean, this is very strange. Almost this is it. Am I overstating it if I say there's a sense of violation in this kind of wormy black marks squiggling across something that is so meticulously constructed? So, clearly these things have deep significance of some kind, and I'm suggesting it's a spiritual significance. Same thing there too. So this has been enough, I think, to show that there is real sense of evolution. If we go back to the explosive, uncontrolled looking early work through to these very deliberate, meticulous constructions that came later. This is one of the pieces I discovered here in New York for $20 or something, published in 1969. There's a real hippie-ish feel to this. I think these are translations, so just to show you, he was also creating work that looked more like regular concrete poetry as well, as indeed does this. I mean, if you look at old anthologies of concrete poetry, you're going to see a great deal of this kind of word play going on. this, this absolutely the books are chock full of this kind of thing. So it interests me less, just because I think it's less distinctive or particular, or more what feels like we know him for. But actually, the work is broader than I'm going to give you a proper sense of here. There's a category of work, the so-called poem objects he made, which are in the book if you're interested, which I'm not going to show. I think I haven't quite come to terms with them. I'm not sure I like them very much. I'm not sure I think they're entirely successful, and I don't respond to them in the same way I do the typestracts. So I'm kind of sticking with the bit that interests me. This is his poem, but realized by a student at the time in 1968. Probably at Bath School of Art, I forget now which one it was, and it's obviously been produced as a print, so I don't want you to think he necessarily did all the work. If you know Ian Hamilton Finley's work of the period, you'll know that you have the poet as a kind of specifier, and then the work, well, it's pretty common though on the sort of contemporary art model, the work is actually realized by a craftsperson in accordance with the instructions. Here we will we'll say a little bit about Buddhism. Now, I'm sure you're aware of the 17th century poet Basho, Japanese poet, who created many haiku, as they're called, 17-syllable poems. And this is a very famous one, very famous indeed. We can get a sense of what the Japanese says from the Robert Aitken version, The Old Pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Now, it's very simple, but once people with a full understanding of Buddhism get to grips with this, these things are extraordinarily packed with meaning. I mean, I don't know how many of you have actually sat there and read haiku. I mean, by Basho, for instance. You need to make a large cultural effort, I suppose. But when you do, there's something extraordinary going on there. So, as I say, super famous, this one, and it's been translated into English so many times. I mean, there's over 100 translations of it. There are books that just give you all the translations. So by the time we get to poet James Kirkup, we've reduced the idea to 3 words: pond, frog, plop. So there we are. There's a subtle twist coming up. Here is the Houédard translation. The frog comes first this time. Pond, plop. So what do we have to pay attention to here? And I should say the typography here is probably by John Furnivall, I think. It's not, so you could kind of lay this out any way you like. You can just type it on the page if you like. And there's a lot to be said about the way in which the typographic realization of a concrete poem then really does become a new concrete poem, because it follows that if the materiality of the type is the important thing, if you change the type to something else, you are changing the meaning. In this version, I mean, it sort of jumps out in a way. You start to pay attention, I hope, to the 3 O's, and maybe the recurrence of the O there. What does the O mean? Well, this here I'm going to cheat slightly. I'm going to read a Buddhist scholar on the subject of what the Zen circle, which the O is here, what it might signify. Perhaps some of you know all this already, but anyway. The Zen circle, painted with one sweep of the brush, in a state of mushin, or no mind, reflects the inner insights of the practitioner. It acts as a visual expression of the Buddhist Heart Sutra. Quotes, emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And the monk paints his understanding and experience of this nature of reality. Form and void are interdependent, and the O in Frog Pond, plop, expresses this codependency, this co-existential relationship. As a Zen circle, its boundary blurs into the Zen calligraphic traditions, etc., etc. So this really is, a matter of the gravest significance. It seems like the simplest little thing, almost nothing, but for Houédard, goes to the very heart of existence. This condition of so-called no mind. this state which is beyond our clamoring egos, which we live with the whole time, which we barely ever manage to escape. This is about trying to, here, through the medium of poetry, move towards a condition of enlightenment where the ego is let go, and that, I'm dwelling on this point here, but I think if you then were later, if you look at the book, to go back to some of the typestracts, the poems, you begin to get a sense of what they are about. I said at the start about this state of egolessness. That's what it's about for Houédard. That's what he seems to be exploring in the work itself. Okay, just some other examples. Can't go into this in great detail. This was a memorial for another concrete poet who died very young. Interestingly, if you look at the piece bottom right, it was reconstructed by a London typographer called Fraser Muggeridge in 2012. If there are any type nuts in the audience, you might even recognise the typeface as one called Flaxman, designed by Edward Wright, who we saw earlier. This is actually used on the Scotland Yard, that's the big police station in London, on the famous revolving Scotland Yard sign. So it was used in the original. It was carefully reused by Muggeridge. This thing has a complicated significance to do with the ancient art of cheese rolling, and I'm just not going to go there, frankly. We don't have the time. There are a lot of these kind of pieces as well. This one is rather beautiful. It's a palindrome, obviously, reads the same way, forward and backwards, drawn inward. I mean, that's, it's, again, the spiritual idea. And Houédard created a lot of these, which he called them reversals. I mean, I hardly need to explain what's happening here. This is his hand, he's wielded the felt tip pen or whatever it was that created this. Here's another one. By rotating it, it reads differently. So published in this book, a book of reflections and reversals in 1975. A lot of people, fans, designer fans, seem attracted to this. Maybe it's the artlessness of realization that appeals to me less, but I suspect I'm missing the point there. So don't listen to me on that one. Here's another one, perhaps cheats a bit because of the way reverses the end, so it's not a strict kind of solution. And the publishing goes on. In the 70s, he's involved in one called Crocklock. Here are the covers. You do see a few of these things on the internet now. I haven't said until this point that that's one of the sort of obstacles to Houédard studies is that, of course, he died before the World Wide Web arrives. And there, like a lot of people who may have bulked reasonably large at the time, in their day, they sort of lost out in that moment because, if you make your reputation now, it all automatically goes online. If you were alive and working when the internet really took off for people, again, people putting your work online. But people who died just before, like he did, the stuff never was online. It's only going to go online if new generations of enthusiasts decide to put it there. And now, because of the book, a bit more is available. But as I also said earlier, a lot of this stuff is either in archives, like the Sackner archives, so that's their property. It's up to them whether they want to put it online or not. Or it's hidden. It's out there somewhere. We don't know about it. I mean, it would be nice if people who, they might now be in their 60s or 70s, suddenly decided as a gift to the world to scan their pieces and put them online. I mean, in a way, why not? But until that starts to happen, there's remarkably little to be found there. And when you see the stuff that circulates on Tumblr, it's the usual thing. Someone finds something that has been on the internet all along, but it just gets endlessly passed on and repeated. It doesn't actually add to our knowledge pool at all. But someone who has got Crocklock put these online, and that's how I happen to have these scans, thanks to that person. So it only ran for 4 issues, and you can see things are kind of running down because it's spread out from 71 through to 76. I mentioned these anthologies earlier, and if you want to follow up any of this, this is kind of an essential place to start. Probably the one on the left, published by Dick Higgins Something Else Press, that's probably pretty easy to find now. I actually bought mine from Higgins when he was still alive. I mean, and it cost, I don't know, $15 or something. It seems incredible now. But this was back in the 90s. The Eugene Wildman collection, published in Chicago, in the middle, that was one I picked up here in New York, but that is American, so that's fairly easy to find. All of these have a few pieces by Houédard in, but they're not, like I say, they're not photographically reproduced. So if we're going to be purist about it, they're not ideal, actually, as representations of what the word is. And this one on the right, I would love to have that. And if I can find myself $150, I can perhaps buy it, because that one's become rare. That's I'd love to get hold of that one. I think the cover is by Tom Phillips. Some of you may know him, a kind of British artist interested in language, combinations of word and image. Did that famous book, A Humament, which he continues to revise forever, and you can even see hints of its graphic style in there. There was a big study day at the end, after the book came out, at the end of 2012, and all the kind of people who were still around from the early days, including John Sharkey there, who did the Mind Play book, they all turned up for it. Tom Phillips was there. I guess it's nice for that generation to see a return of interest among younger people in that work. Any type fans in the audience, Wim Crowell fans, may like this one. He did a series of catalogues for the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and again, this is great source material if you're a student of this era. The famous concrete poetry exhibition at the Stedelijk in 1970, again, has material on Houédard in it. There was a travelling show produced by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1971 in the museums in London. The show went round the country. Here's a poster designed by John Furnival, who I was telling you about earlier. That is supposed to be a kind of symbolic representation of Houédard himself with, well, what kind of wisdom is this issuing from his mouth there? Here, this too. Now, this is what really got me going with this. This for so many years, this was the key work. Limited edition booklet, monograph if you like, produced for a British Arts Centre in 1972, and it was here in New York in the Steeler. He had one. And this book, the reason if you really want to study this guy, this is wonderful, but the guy who compiled the chronology in this book admits a lot of it came from this earlier Sealfrith number 15 book, and so you've got everything is listed, all the man's writings in the most obscure publications. If you need a kind of checklist to get out there searching, it really remains an essential document. It publishes some of his writings as well as the poems, critical essays and so on. So it is itself a great example of small press, small scale, committed publishing. We're coming to the end of what I want to say now. I mentioned typewriter art again. If you're interested in this stuff, this is an essential book from that period, 1975. That actually is a Houédard on the cover there, which we can see in colour. And this book is unusual because the works themselves are photographed, and they are, it's crude actually compared to the standard of reproduction we would expect now, but they are shown in colour, most of them in the book. So here, finally, even in that period, we get a sense of what the thing was like on the sheet itself. So that is precisely this subject that, as I say, will be updated in the new book. And I realized retrospectively that this was my introduction to Houédard. Again, I'm showing you a lot of old books, but we're researchers, so this stuff is gold dust for us. This book, Art Without Boundaries, is a British book. I don't know if it was distributed in America, but it's certainly an international book in scope. But this is a gold mine of a book, and the argument is there in the title, Art Without Boundaries. You've got so-called fine artists, but shown alongside filmmakers, graphic designers, typographers, cartoonists, and concrete poets, all in one book, all presented by the editors as examples of art as communication. And their definition of art is that it is a communication system, and they absolutely refuse to draw qualitative distinctions between what we might say is the lower art form of the cartoon or a piece of graphic design or indeed these concrete poems. And so it's bizarre. I had this book, I guess, in the mid-70s, and back then I was interested in all the other stuff and kind of I don't think I knew what this was going on about. It was just, you blank it, and then later you go back to it and you realise that's where you found it in the first place. That had sort of planted a seed that then took quite a while to grow. So I want to end with a quote. In fact, it's the last words of that statement in the book that you were just looking at, written by Houédard, that captures what it's all about. I see my typestracts as icons depicting sacred questions, dual space probes of inner and outer. They should probably be viewed like cloud tracks and tide ripples, bracken pattern and gull flights, or simply as horizons and spirit levels. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you, Rick. Let's take a seat over here if you don't mind. Sorry, we might have to evict you. There are some chairs outside the door if you just want to grab one and wheel it in. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's that too. Yeah, give us some more light over here. I think you actually have to turn that on. Yeah, great. Thank you, Rick. Fascinating stuff. That's probably a bit bright. Interrogation.
Yeah. The interrogation.
Exactly.
What the hell was that all?
It was, you did go deep. All right, so
but I actually, well, that's nice if you think so, but I always, I've spoken about this several times now, and always I feel I'm not doing him justice. Because
it is so deep. Well,
it is deep.
Well, I have a couple of questions about him and your talk, and then I'd love to draw out a couple of points that might have a broader application. First of all, I'm curious whether he took any of these experiments beyond the typewriter into the computer, early sort of forms of word processing or computer. Did he? Because they seem to predate. They predict so much ASCII text and so forth.
Not so far as we know. Oh yes, why don't I use that? Not so far as we know. I said about how by the late 70s he was sort of withdrawing. I think conditions within the Abbey changed. Maybe the regime of the time was less tolerant. He was given a job in the infirmary, so looking after other sick monks, taking care of them. He apparently did this with great sensitivity, compassion, diligence. He just seems to have accepted, because he was, after all, a religious man, that perhaps his life had moved into another stage, and clearly, he was thinking, he was writing, he was speaking, but not about the visual arts in the same way, not that we know of. So it would be astonishing to find that he found time out to nip into London to make use of one of the newfangled new computers.
Because he seems curious about everything, and I could imagine him tracking that as
perhaps something will emerge.
Yeah, the next phase. I'm also curious as well about. No, it's all right. I'll shout. You keep it.
Oh.
I wonder if you identified a kind of tension, perhaps, between this his desire, the self-effacing desire, the reduction of ego, and so forth, and yet this prolificness and this sending out, and perhaps with a mind to building a legacy and an archive. So, in the sense that maybe the true effacing of ego is to destroy these things in some way. And how do you explore that at all? Sort of sense of archive building.
I explained how the work is often just given away. Which, all right, and that's double-edged, isn't it? On the one hand, it is an ego-full thing to do, to give someone an expression of yourself, like they would want it, like they might keep it. But on the other hand, to produce the thing, like an artwork, as if it were an artwork, and then to give it away without keeping a record, without documenting it, without bothering about its future history, without taking it into your gallery to try and sell it, they use this word, he used this word, overspill, and I quite like that, the sense that he is spilling over. He's got all of this to offer and to give, and he does, and it comes out, and yes, paradoxically it is an expression of ego, that the sense of him, for all that he might have been as self-effacing in many ways, is someone who was very definitely, resolutely, persuasively present. He was there. He was going out. He was making connections. He was persuading people to do things. He was advocating for an artistic cause. But my understanding, such as it is all of that is in the service of the greater cause, and the greater cause for him is ultimately a spiritual one, and all of this work is expressive of that. So human beings are like that, aren't they? Unless you're a total shrinking violet and you really don't want to say anything to anyone, you're going to be out there trying to make an impression, aren't you? And he did too.
Well, I just find it interesting as a historian to sort of somehow toggling back between those ideas. And what else did I want to ask you about? I wonder too about let's talk about today and what we've bridged with the students, because we started off the morning with you talking about adversarial combative writing and this kind of identifying targets for critical takedowns and the need for this and this kind of there's a very passionate you made a passionate case for it, and yet in here we have an example of a deep but felt appreciation of individual. And I wonder how that works in how you make choices in your subject matter, and whether it's to do with the fact that this is a historical subject matter and if that affects things.
Well, I've done this, as you know, for a very long time, and during that time, you become aware, sort of, that it's happening. That you go through phases, phases of concentrating on something. It could be an area, it could be a set of individuals in that area, it could be a theme. For a while, I was very committed to the idea of a combative cultural criticism, and I really got going with that. Round about sort of 97, 98, that's when it starts to emerge. I won't go into all the details, but there were very specific reasons why that happened then. They are to do with the nature of the times and my response to them. But also what you think you see, as it were. You sort of look around at the culture and something strikes you, and if you feel as a writer other people aren't saying it or saying it strongly enough, you might feel you wanted to add your voice. So all of that happened to me. And I did that for quite a long time, probably fairly intensely for a decade. But then, what can I say? I got a bit older, I moved on, I got bored with saying the same thing over and over again. I got tired, today that may seem an odd thing to say, I got tired of lecturing people. And I think the last time I gave a really political lecture was in Warsaw a couple of years ago. And I did it almost for old time's sake. And I went over what to me seems very familiar ground, and it was fine. And it got it provoked a response. It was meant to be provocative, and it provoked a response. But I thought, why am I saying? I don't actually want to say this right now. I don't want to say this. Let someone else say this. It's not for me to keep saying this. If I had any kind of effect in saying it, then that was in the past, and now my focus is elsewhere. So, what fascinates me about him? Well, so many things, but one key thing is the element of crossover. I love this idea of the condition of being between poetry and painting. What is that? Where is that? What can you do there? Why hasn't that been given more attention? what is it about it that engages me so? And so, you know, a lot of the writing I've done has been about the points where things meet. And because I, you know, did a lot of writing about graphic design, it's the point about where graphic design meets something else. I actually found my way to this work through studying the history of graphic design, as manifested by Typographica magazine. But in the end, you know, for me, Houédard as a figure is more interesting because of the worlds he spans than some of the designers who inspired him. Except where their own work, you know, deliberately reaches out into these other areas.
Right, or when you get a sense of the network.
Yeah, the network. So that's. Yeah. So I often think, God, this kind of writing is not very saleable, is it? It's not very marketable. As soon as the first project I ever did, which was about visual responses to the music of Brian Eno, immediately faced that problem. The book, is that a design book? Is that an art book? Because it's got those things in it, or is it a music book? Where the hell in the shop does that go? And, you know, and that was back in '86, and we all, the people involved in the project, Russell Mills, the artist, Malcolm Garrett, the designer, we ran into this problem immediately. We thought, since there couldn't be a special part of the shop, perhaps they could put it in 2 or 3 places to catch, you know, how naive can you get? You're constantly channeled towards, you know, one clear-cut space that everyone can understand. But there we are. That project that the book was about was more than the sum of its parts. It was about a place of fusion, about a kind of hybrid activity. So I'm just drawn to that. It's not all I'm drawn to, but I'm really drawn to it as a writer. And I suppose it's because you think, well, I mean, it's changed now. There are more people who want to engage with it now. But you sort of feel you need a special combination of skills. You need knowledge from both fields to do that convincingly, and that's a challenge. So that's a sort of recent theme. A lot of what I write about, probably for the last 3, 4, 5 years, has been in this sort of these border zones.
You should keep doing. And then the last question before we open up to the audience that I had for you is to do with that, how the venues and formats and publishing sort of vehicles for this kind of work. It's a subject close to my heart, you know, the fact that when you write something scholarly and academic, and that does attempt to go deep, but yet you want it to look good and reach people. Yeah. Now you pointed to occasional papers as a possible sort of exemplar of a way forward out of that impasse.
Yes.
Do you get a sense, I mean, can we revolutionize academic publishing? Do you think this is going to...
Well, of course, a lot of academics will say they're interested in interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. You know, that's been the buzzword for as long as any of us can remember, hasn't it? You know, in theory, that's what it's all about. And I think the way in which these research projects are configured now, there is more and more attempt to investigate these meeting points and overlaps. So, you know, I think in terms of selling the books that might come out of this, that's still tough if we're going to use bookshops as the means to do it. I mean, in a way, online it ought to be easy to configure a space where the hybrids live. You know, it might be the ideal place to put them, since, you know, the bookshelf in the bookshop is too physical and too specific. But if the idea is presented virtually, then it can inhabit any kind of new space, and that's good. I certainly think there's a huge audience of smart and, you know, often academic people who are interested in these crossovers. Yeah. Crossovers are old history, really, as we saw. You know, it's been going on for decades.
But I mean, in terms of being rediscovered and got out to new audiences through different publishing ventures and platforms, I think it's a great moment for that. Got some of these people in the room.
Of course, and occasional papers. I mean, I don't know how familiar people are, but the founders are Sarah de Bont, who is a designer with bookish and historical interests for sure, but, you know, comes from graphic design, educated as a graphic designer, and an art historian called Anthony Hudek. I think they're probably married now. Certainly they're partners in every sense. It's a very close-knit team, and, you know, he does curatorial projects. He's worked as a teacher, as an academic. I mean, he is a PhD, he is an academic. So there it is, that fusion. Sarah knows how to present these things in a way that will appeal to our kind of audience, which they absolutely do. They're gentle, kind of quietly toned publications, but they're positioned just right. They're very cool in their quiet way. And Anthony brings the, fully educated academic rigor to the process. And they're both the sweetest people. I mean, they're amazing people to work with. They really are fantastic. Yeah.
Let's take a couple of questions before we go and have a drink with Rick.
I'm not paying, by the way.
How important is the fact that he is a monk related to your interest?
Actually, that's a very good question, because I'm certainly, like, I hope you guys, but other people I've spoken to about it, I was immediately intrigued by that. That is just fascinating. And my sense over the last decade, when there was this period when I would think about him and I think perhaps I should be the one to write something about him, but no, he was getting no attention. And during that time I was thinking, wow, someone should write a biography. You can just, it seems a bit left field, a bit bizarre, but the only way to really present, as it were, the cultural breadth of this guy is for a very highly informed, smart, creative writer to tell the story. Now, I haven't mentioned before, there is a biography now in the works. Charles Veary, who was a concrete poet, wrote about them in the 60s, knew Houédard, and is the guy behind that Sealfrith book I was enthusing about at the end, the early monograph. He is writing a biography, and and he is deeply immersed in such things as the historical connection between the Catholic Church and Buddhist teachers, going back to before the Second World War, I believe. So it's not it's not special or unique to Houédard. There were others too. And so it needs someone who really is fascinated by that, can probe it, get inside it, but at the same time, and this is the key thing, and the thing I always hope for, would have a sense of the contemporary audience and could write about what could seem amazingly rarefied, arcane work and such a bizarre, unusual kind of lifestyle for us, as 21st century people, to actually voluntarily withdraw from the world in this way, become a celibate monk, and I think about 13 men in Britain a year go into that now. This has become an incredibly unusual and indeed, probably moribund life choice. I mean, it's just, people just don't want to do it anymore. And that was, even probably, so if you write about it now, you've somehow got to explain the validity, that's such a patronizing word, isn't it? But why someone would choose to do that? What kind of a mind, what kind of a thinker, what kind of a way of perceiving the world would lead you to devote yourself in that way? So yes, I'm absolutely fascinated by that. I think that sense of, I was talking about egolessness, but of giving up, of renunciation, of saying, I don't need these worldly material things because there are other issues, spiritual issues, which are of much greater importance to me. That's extraordinary. That still has something to teach us, I think. So the writer, the writer of this book, Charles Veary, I hope he can bring that alive. There's not just talk about these as historical issues and dilemmas and solutions, but as choices that could have meaning for us now, as manifested, of course, through the work itself. He's got to sort of cover all these bases. Tremendous challenge. It's a piece of writing. But wouldn't it be fantastic if it comes out and it's reviewed in the Sunday papers, and it's it's small, it's not going to be big seller, but it's a kind of hit. People say, fantastic. He brought back this cultural figure who deserved to be brought back. Yeah, and who was that George?
Yeah,
maybe.
Thanks for speaking. That was really interesting. I noticed that he signed his name lowercase d-s-h,
Yeah.
which I thought was kind of visually charming, but also interesting in this broader context of the egolessness and as a monk. Did you come across anything of significance of why he did that? Or
to explain that. Well, here you need Charles Veary, you need the biographer. He could probably, if he's been in the archives long enough, he can locate the moment it starts to happen. For all I know, you know, he was doing it throughout the 50s. But it's interesting to us because we can't fail to see it and read it in terms of a modernist type choice.
Right.
You know, all those Dutch designers and Germans who set things in all lowercase. It's almost like he's... But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's the signal. It's closer to what you said. But I could believe I actually could believe he liked the look of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure he did. Maybe it did appear to have a sort of a quietness, a humility. But on the other hand, he signed everything, so it's not that, which is Alice's point, it's not that humble. The work is authored, yeah.
Two observations, really, from both ends of the telescope. I'm kind of a lapsed medievalist, and there are some medieval illuminators who are doing some of the same things about the placement of the word on the page, and also doing some of the same things in marginalia. And I want to run home and look for some things that are in the British Library that perhaps he even actually might have seen.
Yeah. Yeah, and he knew about it. I mean, he produced for that ICA exhibition in '65. He produced a chronology of, you know, of this kind of, we'll call it the history of visual poetry, but of these kind of connections. When that's the thing. I didn't really talk about this at any great length. When you read his what are we going to call them? His critical writings on the subject, the sweep of his knowledge, his historical knowledge, you know, from, as you say, medieval manuscripts through to a detailed grasp of the history of 20th century modernism, is just extraordinary. Yes, sorry.
Alice touched on ASCII art, and I think you won't find it on the World Wide Web, but if you go back a little bit before that to some of the ASCII artists who were working in Unix-based systems, if you do a Gopher search and things, I think that there were some people, maybe Mark Plump, Hanscam, or Henry Beauregard, there were some people who I think were interested in him, who were inspired by him. If he didn't actually get onto the internet, I think there may be some people.
Well, thank you for that, and that's great. I mean, I'm not sure I can do a lot with it, but what I am in touch with Charles Veary, and I will try to pass that, because, you know, again, I think he's well, I'm not sure of his age, but probably late 60s. I don't think he's going to be digitally adept, you know, without a certain amount of encouragement in the way that you're describing. So he just may be unaware of that. But if you think those later figures, the ASCII people, were influenced, I know that's of course important to know about. Yeah, the legacy. Yeah. Thank you.
One last question.
That was a wonderful talk. I do think that there's a connection to the digital, though, in sort of expanded states of mind, and this idea that sort of there's an opening of the mind into a virtual space or into a space that's sort of somehow collectively authored or something like that. And I didn't know if that sort of thought. I mean, the DSH almost reminds me of a kind of amen at the end of this sort of meditative typing. There's something so beautiful about that in a kind of altered state of mind or prayer.
Yeah. Well, what a shame he didn't live long enough to tell us what he felt about that. Because I can imagine he would have been engaged. He would have seen it. He would, you know, it would have opened. It might. Who knows? It might have opened up new possibilities. So I think you're right. And I felt actually going way back. We in when was it? 96. We published an article about concrete poetry by a guy called Peter Mayer, who again was one of those figures on the scene in London. And he may still be alive, but he was already pretty ancient even then. And he later did a piece also about visual prose for I, so those two pieces. And I was trying to get him, I was telling him about the new developments in digital typography, telling him about David Carson, but also some of the emigre stuff, showing him and saying, well, look, for us, the interesting thing, it's interesting historically, but we want to make the connection. It seems like a good moment with people like Phil Baines saying, yeah, what did I look at in our art school? I was looking at the concrete poets. Baines, a significant figure with the new experimental typography in Britain. The links were there, and even if people like Carson weren't fully aware of that, I don't know for sure, but that somehow they'd stumbled into a territory that made complete sense to someone like Mayer coming from that earlier world. So I felt then, it's why we published the article, the conditions are right for a re-evaluation. But we didn't get an overwhelming feedback to that, so maybe we were slightly too soon with it.
Well, here at Secret, we don't ask you to renounce your worldly ways. We have wine and cheese.
Thank God for that.
So before we go, there's a